Deep in the twisted hollows of Odd, West Virginia, where the ridge is close like a fist and the sun only finds the ground in thin, reluctant slivers, there stands a sagging cabin that decent folk cross the creek to avoid. The year was 1937 when Gracie, barely 16, stood barefoot on the frozen porch in a dress sewn from flour sacks, her wrists bruised purple from her brother's grip the night before. The preacher, if you could call a whisker-soaked cousin with a stolen collar a preacher, muttered words over them while the wind rattled the tin roof like bones in a box. She knew what was coming. Everyone in that hollow knew. Their father had died the winter before, coughing blood into the snow, and their mother followed him into the ground not 2 months later, whispering with her last breath that the family line must stay clean. Clean. That was the word they used while the world outside burned coal and fought wars and pretended places like this no longer existed. Clean meant brothers married sisters. Clean meant locking the doors when the children tried to run. Clean meant burying the ones who were born wrong in unmarked graves behind the smokehouse. Grace's brother, Ray, twice her size and already missing half his teeth from rage and rot, held the shotgun across his knees during the ceremony like it was part of the vows. When the cousin pronounced them man and wife, Ray smiled the way a wolf smiles, slow, certain, and hungry. That night the screams carried farther than usual, down through the laurel thickets and across the iced-over creek, but no lights came on in the distant houses. People in these mountains have always known how to look away. 9 months later, Gracie brought forth a son whose eyes were set too far apart and whose tongue lolled thick and useless in his mouth. They named him John, after their father, and they kept him in the back room where the windows were boarded shut. That was only the beginning. What happened in that cabin over the next 80 years would seep out in whispers, in courthouse records sealed for decades, in the terrified testimony of the few who managed to crawl out alive. It would become the case that made even hardened detectives turn away from photographs. A bloodline so tangled it looked less like a family tree and more like a noose. And somewhere, in the dark heart of America, the last of them are still waiting behind those boarded windows, listening for footsteps on the porch that never quite go away. The year was 1937, and the hollow outside the little coal camp town of Odd, West Virginia, lay gripped in one of the coldest snaps anyone could remember. The ridges rose so steep and close that daylight arrived late and left early, sliding down the mountainsides like something ashamed to be seen. Down a rutted wagon trace that hadn't felt the weight of a proper vehicle in a decade stood a tar-papered cabin with a leaning chimney and a single pane of real glass in the front window. The rest were oiled cloth or nothing at all. On the morning of December 17th, smoke rose thin and grey from that chimney, carrying the smell of fatback and despair. Inside, the air was thick with the sour stink of unwashed bodies and the sharper bite of moonshine still sweating from the night before. Every relative who still drew breath, and there weren't many, had been summoned. They came on foot, sliding down the frozen slopes in burlap-wrapped shoes, clutching mason jars and rifles older than the century. No one spoke above a whisper. Outsiders weren't told. The county clerk would never see a license. The state of West Virginia, busy pretending its mountains were empty of anything but coal and timber, would remain blissfully ignorant for another 80 years. Gracie stood on the porch in a dress her mother had pieced together from Purina feed sacks the spring before she died. The girl was 16, slight as a reed, with cheekbones sharp enough to cut paper and eyes the color of creek water after a rain, cloudy, shifting, impossible to read. Her bare feet had gone numb against the frost-slick boards, but she didn't move. Behind her, the door hung open just enough for the heat to leak out and the cold to crawl in. Ray filled the doorway like a dark eclipse. 28 years old, 6'4" in his sock feet, shoulders wide from years of swinging a pick in narrow seams before the mine shut down and left him with nothing but time and rage. His beard was patchy, his remaining teeth the color of walnut hulls, and the family shotgun rested easy across his forearm the way another man might hold a Bible. When he looked at his sister, his eyes held no brotherly recognition, they held ownership. Their cousin Delbert, drunk since Thursday and wearing a mail-order preacher's collar 2 sizes too tight, cleared his throat and spat into the dead weeds. The ceremony took 4 minutes. No rings, no flowers, no music except the wind worrying the tin roof and the distant, uneasy lowing of a cow that hadn't been milked in 2 days. When Delbert muttered man and wife, Ray leaned down and pressed his mouth to Grace's like a brand. She didn't flinch, she had already learned that flinching only made it worse. By the time the sun bled out behind the ridge that evening, the thing was done. The bloodline had closed its circle again, tighter than before, and the mountains swallowed the sound of a girl's future snapping in 2.9 months later, on a night in late September 1938 when the first hard frost silvered the ragweed and the moon hung low and bloated over the ridge. Grace's time came. There was no doctor within 20 miles who would climb that trace for love or money, and the granny woman who used to midwife the hollow had died the previous winter. So it was just the women left, Aunt Lulla with her gnarled hands and Cousin Pearl, who was simple-minded and terrified of blood, crouched around the iron bedstead while Ray paced the dog trot with the shotgun, growling at anyone who made too much noise. Gracie had been laboring since dawn, her cries growing thinner as the hours bled away. The cabin reeked of sweat, kerosene, and the metallic tang of fear. When the baby finally slid into Lula's trembling palms, slick and blue-tinged, the room went still enough to hear the tick of the tin clock on the mantel. The child was a boy, small but whole at first glance, until Lula turned him toward the lamp. His eyes were set too far apart, almost on the sides of his head like a deer's, and the lids drooped strangely so that only slivers of milky blue showed. The skull was elongated, the soft spot at the crown pulsing too wide and too slow. When he opened his mouth to wail, the tongue filled it entirely, thick and pale, lolling against his lower lip like a slug trying to escape. A ridge of gum showed no promise of teeth ever coming in properly. His fingers were fused in places, two on the left hand webbed together like a duck's foot, and the big toe on the right foot grew at a sharp angle, almost backward. Lula's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped him. Pearl let out a high, animal keen and backed into the corner, pressing her apron to her mouth. Even the fire seemed to shrink in the hearth. Ray shoved the door open hard enough to crack the facing board and stared down at the bundle. For one heartbeat something flickered across his face, revulsion, maybe even fear, but it hardened again into the familiar mask of ownership. "John," he said, naming the boy after their dead father without asking Grace's leave. "He's a Whittaker. He stays." They wrapped the infant in a flour sack towel stained yellow from years of use and carried him not to the cradle by the fire, but to the back room where the window had been boarded over since spring. The door was closed, the latch dropped. Outside, the mountains stood silent, and the frost deepened on the pumpkin vines nobody would ever harvest. The winter of 1941 arrived early and mean, burying the hollow under drifts so deep the creek froze solid and the coal camp store closed its doors for weeks. Old John Whittaker, the father who had drilled the creed of pure blood into every child with a belt and a Bible, had been gone 2 years already, his lungs rotted out by decades in the low seam. Then, in the first week of February, their mother, Eula, followed him. She had wasted away since little John's birth, her body shrinking like a dried apple doll, eyes sunk deep and accusing. On her last night she clutched Grace's wrist with surprising strength and rasped the same words over and over, "Keep it in the family, girl. Don't let the line stray. Promise me." Gracie promised, because promises were easier than the beating that came if she didn't. By morning Eula was cold, her mouth frozen open mid-whisper. Ray dug the grave himself behind the smokehouse, hacking at the iron ground with a mattock until his hands bled, cursing the whole time. He wrapped his mother in the same quilt she'd been married under and lowered her down without a prayer. No one marked the spot except a flat river stone he kicked over the mound. That night he drank the last of the moonshine and smashed the empty jar against the hearth. When the shards stopped flying, the cabin felt bigger, emptier, and far more dangerous. With both parents in the ground, Ray became the law. At 32 he was the oldest living male, and the mountain had taught him that might was the only deed that mattered. He took their father's straight razor, the one with the pearl handle, and shaved in the cracked mirror every Sunday whether he needed it or not, just to watch the blade glide under his own steady hand. He took the best cuts of meat, the warmest spot by the fire, and the only chair with a back. He took the keys to the padlock on the smokehouse and decided who ate and who waited. Most of all, he took the family's story and twisted it tighter. He gathered the children, Gracie, now 19 and hollow-eyed, Pearl, who rocked and hummed, and the cousins who still lived close enough to fear him, around the hearth and spoke in the low, flat voice their father had used. "Ain't no outsiders coming in here no more," he said, eyes reflecting the flames like wet stones. "We keep what's ours. We marry who we got. That's how we stay strong. Little John, not yet 3, sat in the shadows of the back-room doorway, his wide-set eyes tracking the firelight, tongue working silently against his lip. Ray glanced at him and nodded, satisfied. See? His proof it works. From that night on, doors were barred at dusk. Anyone who mentioned leaving felt the weight of Ray's hand across the mouth or the stock of the shotgun against the ribs. The cabin, once merely poor, turned into a fortress of silence and obedience, its walls closing in with every creak of the floorboards under Ray's heavy step. Gracie rocked her deformed son in the dark and listened to her brother sharpening the razor on the strop, the rhythmic scrape counting down the days until the next demand would come. Pearl stopped humming altogether. The mountains, blanketed in snow, kept every secret they were given. By the spring of 1946 the war was over everywhere except in that hollow. Radios in the valley crackled with victory parades and returning soldiers kissing sweethearts on courthouse steps, but up the trace the only sound was Ray's axe splitting kindling with the same rhythm he used when he split anything that stood against him. Gracie was 24 now, thin as fence wire, her once cloudy eyes gone flat and grey. Little John was 8, kept mostly in the back room because his shambling gait and wordless grunts frightened the younger cousins. Pearl had taken to sleeping in the loft with the chickens rather than risk Ray's wandering hands after dark. Ray had begun watching Gracie differently since their mother's death, the way a man watches a field he intends to plough whether it wants rain or not. He spoke of needing more hands for the place, of keeping the blood strong, of how their father would have expected it. At night he stood in the doorway of her room longer than necessary, the lantern behind him throwing his shadow across the quilt until she felt swallowed by it. The decision came on a Sunday in May when dogwood petals drifted like dirty snow and the creek ran high with snowmelt. Ray sent the cousins down the ridge on a made-up errand for salt they didn't need. He barred the front door, dropped the wooden latch, and told Gracie to put on the same feedsack dress she'd worn for their first ceremony. She stood frozen in the middle of the floor, John clinging to her skirt with his webbed fingers, his thick tongue working in distress. Ray set the shotgun on the table within easy reach. "Ain't asking," he said, voice flat as creek ice. "Mama's gone. I'm the head now. You're mine by right." When she opened her mouth to protest he backhanded her so hard she tasted blood and saw sparks. Pearl peeked from the loft ladder and disappeared again without a sound. There was no cousin preacher this time. Ray read the vows himself from the flyleaf of the family Bible, stumbling over the words like they were stones in his mouth. When he reached the part about those whom God hath joined, he laughed once, low and wet, and closed the book. He took her that night on the same iron bed where she'd birthed John, the springs screaming under their weight while the boy rocked in the corner and beat his head softly against the wall. Afterward Ray slept heavy with satisfaction, one arm flung across her like a chain. Gracie lay staring at the ceiling, feeling the bruises bloom across her ribs and something colder settle in her chest. Outside, the dogwoods kept shedding their petals, white against the dark leaves, drifting down to rot in the mud. The mountains watched without comment, the way they always had. October 1951 brought a rare dry spell, the kind that turned the dirt trace into powder and made every footstep echo like a warning. The Reverend Elias Goines, a circuit rider from Boone County with a limp from the Great War and a calling he still believed in, had been told there were souls up Odd Hollow who hadn't seen a preacher since baptism. He rode a sway-backed mule as far as the creek would let him, then walked the rest, black coat flapping, Bible tucked under one arm and a sack of peppermints for the children in his pocket. He smelled the cabin before he saw it, wood smoke laced with something sour and animal. When he stepped into the clearing, the dogs set up a ragged chorus but wouldn't come closer than the clothesline. The front door stood open a handspan, and inside the shadows moved slow. A girl's voice rose sharp and sudden, cut off as if a hand had been clapped over it. Elias called out the old greeting, "Travel in man, seek in water and the Lord's peace," the way preachers had done in these hills for 100 years. Ray appeared in the doorway like something conjured, shotgun loose in the crook of his arm, eyes red-rimmed and flat. Behind him the room was dark despite the daylight, the windows filmed with soot and age. Elias smiled the way a man smiles at a chained hound, showing no teeth. "Heard there might be young uns here nade in scripture," he said. "I don't take collections, just carry the word." Ray didn't move. From deeper in the cabin came another sound, half sob, half growl, that didn't belong to any natural throat. Elias's smile faltered. He took one step closer and caught a glimpse past Ray's bulk, a woman on her knees scrubbing the floorboards with lye so strong it raised steam, her dress clinging to welts on her back. In the corner something pale and misshapen rocked on all fours, head too large, eyes catching the light like a startled deer's. The Reverend's voice softened. "Sister, are you hurt?" The scrubbing stopped. Gracie lifted her head, hair hanging in wet ropes, and for one heartbeat her eyes met Elias's, pleading, dead, ancient. Then Ray shifted, blocking the doorway entirely. "Private property," Ray said. "Service already held." Elias heard the click of the shotgun hammer, though he never saw Ray's hand move. Still, he stood his ground a moment longer, the way a man tests how hot the fire really is. The thing in the corner growled again, louder, and Gracie dropped the brush and crawled backward until she disappeared into shadow. The Reverend backed away slow, palms open, the peppermints in his pocket suddenly ridiculous. When he reached the clothesline, the dogs finally rushed him, silent, teeth bared. He swung the Bible once, hard, felt it connect with a skull, and ran. Behind him the cabin door slammed like a coffin lid. The mountains swallowed his ragged breathing and the echo of that inhuman sound that followed him all the way to the creek. December 1954 came in with a wind that cut straight through the cabin walls and a moon so bright the snow glowed blue. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, and Ray lay passed out drunk across the table, one arm dangling, fingers brushing the neck of an empty jar. He had been worse since the preacher's visit 3 years earlier, more watchful, more cruel, as if the sight of an outsider had reminded him how thin the barrier was between his kingdom and the world. In the back room, 12-year-old Betty, Grace's second child, born a year after the forced marriage, pressed her ear to the floorboards and listened to her mother's breathing finally slow into sleep. Betty was small for her age, narrow-shouldered, with the same wide-set eyes as her older brother John, but sharper, always watching. She had learned early that silence was safer than tears, that doors could be opened if you waited long enough for the latch to be forgotten. Tonight the latch was forgotten. Ray had staggered in at dusk, roaring about a fox in the henhouse, and never bothered to drop the wooden bar across the back door. Betty had lain awake counting his snores until they turned thick and wet. Now she eased the quilt off her legs, careful not to disturb John, who slept curled like a dog in the corner, tongue working against his lip even in dreams. She wore every scrap of clothing she owned, 2 dresses, a man's wool sock on each hand, her mother's cast-off shawl tied tight around her head. The floor was ice under her bare feet when she stood, but she didn't feel it. She had one plan, repeated so many times in the dark that it felt like prayer: follow the creek downstream until the ridge opened up, then keep walking until lights that weren't Ray's lantern appeared. The back door creaked only once. Cold air rushed in and kissed her face like freedom. She stepped onto the porch, snow crust hard enough to hold her weight for 3 steps before it gave and she sank to the knees. Behind her the cabin stayed dark. She looked back once, at the faint glow of the dying fire through the chink logs, at the shape of her mother's body on the pallet, at John's silhouette twitching in his sleep, then turned and started down the slope toward the frozen creek. The water was a black ribbon under the moon, edged with shelves of ice that rang like glass when she stepped on them. She kept to the edge where the laurel grew thick, using branches to pull herself along when the bank got steep. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in her ears. Half a mile down, the creek bent sharp around a sandstone outcrop, and for the first time the cabin was out of sight. She allowed herself one ragged breath that steamed white and vanished. She didn't hear the dogs until they were already on her. The search for Betty lasted 3 days. Ray followed the dogs with a lantern and a length of chain, cursing the cold that numbed his trigger finger. They found her half frozen under a laurel thicket 2 ridges over, lips blue, eyes rolled back to whites, but still breathing. She never spoke again, not truly. After they dragged her home she only stared and rocked, a low humming coming from her throat that made even Ray uneasy. They kept her in the loft after that, wrists tied with baling twine when Ray was gone, and the family learned to step wide around the ladder. In the spring of 1955, while Ray was down at the county seat selling a load of stolen copper wire, Gracie did something she had never dared before. She waited until the youngest cousins were out hunting groundhogs, then climbed the ladder to the loft with a kitchen knife hidden in her apron. Betty sat in the corner chewing on a stick, eyes tracking nothing. Gracie cut the twine, pulled her daughter into her lap, and rocked her the way she hadn't dared since the girl was small. That was when she noticed the corner of something leather protruding from beneath the loose floorboard where Betty slept. She pried the board up with shaking fingers. Dust and mouse droppings spilled out, and then the book, the family Bible, older than the cabin itself, its cover cracked and soft as hide. Ray had taken to hiding it after the preacher's visit, claiming the word was his alone to read. Gracie had never been allowed to touch it. She carried it down the ladder and opened it on the table while sunlight slanted through the chinks like bars. The front pages were the usual begats, written in brown ink that had faded to rust. But starting around 1890 the handwriting changed, tighter, hurried, sometimes smeared as if written in poor light or haste. Names repeated in ways that made her stomach turn. John Whittaker married his sister Lorena, 1893. Their son Henry took his cousin, also his half-sister, Ruth, 1919. Grace's own parents, listed plain as Day, Eula May Whittaker, daughter of Henry, wed to her uncle John, 1920. And there, in Ray's heavier scrawl, added just last year. Ray Whittaker to Gracie Whittaker, his full-blood sister, May 1946. Below that, in the same ink, the births. John, 1938, eyes wide, tongue thick. Betty, 1947, silent after the running. 2 more entries inked over with thick black XS, babies born too wrong to live, buried quick behind the smokehouse. Grace's hands went so cold the pages stuck to her skin. Every name looped back into itself like a snake devouring its tail. The margins held tiny frantic notes in different hands. God sees. Forgive us. He will be born with the mark. The last entry, in Ray's writing, was fresh enough the ink still smelled sharp. Another coming this fall. Keep it pure. She sat until the light moved across the floor and the cousins came home hungry. Then she closed the book, slid it back into its hiding place, and pressed the board down with the heel of her foot until it looked untouched. When Ray returned that night smelling of coal dust and another woman's perfume, she met his eyes without flinching for the first time in years, the weight of every tangled name burning behind her stare. The summer of 1962 baked the hollow until the creek shrank to a chain of muddy puddles and the laurel leaves curled like burnt paper. Ray was 40 now, heavier, meaner, his beard gone grey at the edges and his temper shorter than a lit fuse. The outside world kept pressing closer, a new blacktop road snaked within 5 miles, and sometimes at night you could hear trucks grinding gears on the switchbacks. Ray hated the sound the way other men hate thunder. In July, a county social worker named Margaret Caldwell came looking for Betty. Someone down in the valley, maybe the store clerk who'd seen the girl's face years earlier when Ray dragged her out for salt, had finally made a phone call. Margaret was 27, city-raised, armed with a clipboard and a belief that paperwork could fix anything. She drove as far as her Chevrolet would go, then walked the rest in low heels and a cotton dress already sticking to her back. She found the cabin at noon, heat shimmering off the tin roof. The dogs met her halfway, hackles raised, but she carried pepper spray and a voice that had quieted classrooms. Ray stepped onto the porch bare-chested, suspenders dangling, shotgun cradled like a baby. Margaret introduced herself, polite but firm, and asked to see the children listed on her report. Ray smiled the way a cliff smiles before it drops. "Ain't no children here need your kind of help," he said. When she tried to step around him, he moved just enough to block the doorway, the barrel of the gun rising an inch. Inside, something heavy thumped against a wall and a high, broken keening floated out. Margaret wrote a note on her pad without looking down. "I'll be back with the sheriff," she said, calm as Sunday school. Ray watched her retreat down the trace, then turned and slammed the door so hard the hinges screamed. That night he gathered every soul still breathing in the cabin, Gracie, Pearl, the cousins, even Betty dragged down from the loft, and made them swear on the hidden Bible to say the same lie: no children, no beatings, just a family minding its own. Then he loaded the shotgun with double-aught buck and waited. Margaret never made it to the sheriff. Her car was found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine off the new road, driver's door open, clipboard shattered on the rocks below. The official report called it an accident, brake failure, sharp curve, inexperienced with mountain driving. The coroner noted bruising on the wrists and a blow to the temple that might have come from the steering wheel. No one came looking again for a very long time. Up in the hollow, the dogs grew fat that summer, and Ray took to sitting on the porch after dark, cleaning the same shotgun over and over, the whetstone singing against the barrel while the crickets went quiet one by one. February 1967 arrived with a stillness so complete the snow seemed to muffle even thought. Gracie was 43 now, her body a map of old bruises and new exhaustion, belly swollen again beneath a dress patched so many times the original cloth had vanished. Ray called this one the reckoning child, said it would be strong enough to make up for the weak ones, said he could feel it kicking like a mule. He had taken to rubbing her stomach at night with hands that smelled of gun oil and moonshine, claiming he could already tell it was a boy. The labor started at dusk on the 14th, a thin red sunset bleeding between the ridges. No one came to help this time. Pearl had died the winter before, fallen down the loft ladder with her neck bent wrong, and the cousins kept farther away each year. Only Ray and old John, now 29, heavy-headed and silent, crouched in the room while Gracie bore down on the same blood-stained mattress. The baby came out blue, slick, and wrong from the first breath. Its head was enormous, the skull plates not yet fused, pulsing visibly under skin so thin the veins showed black. The eyes were fused shut into a single ridge of flesh, no lids, no lashes, just a wet seam that wept clear fluid. The mouth was a lipless slit that opened onto a cavern where the tongue had never formed at all, only a stump that fluttered uselessly. Arms and legs ended in fused paddles, no fingers, no toes, just smooth nubs like a seal's flippers. When Ray lifted it by one leg to slap its back, the body bent in the middle as though the spine were made of rope. For once even Ray was quiet. The thing made no sound except a wet clicking deep in its throat, like a chick drowning in its own shell. Gracie turned her face to the wall and refused to look. John rocked in the corner, beating his chest with webbed fists, a low moan rising and falling in time with the wind. Ray carried the infant to the table, laid it on yesterday's newspaper, and stared as if expecting it to change. When it didn't, he fetched the Bible from its hiding place and opened to the birth page. His hand hovered over the inkwell, then closed the book without writing. Instead he wrapped the creature in a feed sack still stenciled with the Purina checkerboard and walked out into the dark. The grave was shallow, the ground was iron-hard and he was drunk. He came back an hour later with snow in his beard and blood on his knuckles where he'd pounded the frozen earth. He never spoke the child's name because he never gave it one. From that night on he drank before noon and stared at Gracie with something new in his eyes, not desire, not even rage, but a kind of animal fear that made the cabin colder than any winter. In the back room John kept moaning, the same 3 notes over and over, as though trying to form a word he had never been taught. Gracie lay bleeding and empty, listening to the wind scour the ridge and wondering how many more times the mountain would demand its price before it finally swallowed them all. The year 2004 found the cabin smaller than memory, its roof sagging under decades of patchwork tin, the porch half collapsed into the weeds. Ray had died in 1989, drunk and raging, pitching face-first into the hearth with the shotgun beside him like a faithful dog. Gracie followed him 3 winters later, curled on the same mattress, whispering apologies to shadows that never answered. The cousins scattered or died off, only the blood that refused to die out remained. John, now 66, ruled the ruin the way his father had, with silence and sudden violence. Betty, 57, and still rocking in the loft, made soft clicking sounds with her tongue when strangers came too close. 2 younger ones, products of unions too tangled to name, lived in the lean-to shed and barked at cars. They survived on disability checks mailed to a post office box nobody ever emptied and on whatever the mountain still gave up: ginseng, copper wire stripped from abandoned mines, the occasional deer shot out of season. Then, in the spring of 2004, a filmmaker from Raleigh named Mark Leiter, soft-spoken, city-pale, carrying a camera instead of a shotgun, talked his way past the dogs with a sack of store-bought cookies and a promise of $20 bills. He came back 3 times, each visit longer, until the family grew used to the red record light and the strange man who didn't flinch at their faces or their smell. In 2020 he posted the first video. 10 minutes of grainy footage, John grinning with 4 brown teeth, Betty humming through her nose, the younger ones grunting and hiding their eyes from the sun. The title was gentle, almost clinical: Inbred Family, The Whitakers. Within hours it had 100,000 views. Within days, millions. Comments poured in like floodwater: horror, pity, disgust, fascination. Reporters followed, then geneticists, then sheriff's deputies with court orders and body cams. DNA tests confirmed what the Bible had already confessed: coefficient of inbreeding higher than any recorded case in the modern United States. The cabin was condemned, the land seized for back taxes nobody had ever paid. They moved the survivors to a cinderblock group home on the edge of Beckley, 4 small rooms with fluorescent lights that never went out and aides who spoke slow and loud. But the video never stops circulating. New edits appear every month, slow zooms on malformed hands, ominous music layered over John's wordless laugh, drone shots of the empty cabin rotting back into the mountain. On quiet nights the algorithm pushes it to new phones in new cities, and teenagers halfway across the country watch with hands over their mouths while the caption reads, "America's most inbred family, still alive." Somewhere in that group home John still rocks, Betty still clicks her tongue, and the mountains, taller now with second-growth timber, keep the boarded-up cabin exactly where it's always been, waiting for the next curious traveler who believes the story ended when the camera stopped rolling.